Welcome to the February meeting for Australian Aviation Historical Society Queensland. The next couple of meetings in March and April will be Zoom meetings only. Congratulations on our newsletter editor, Jeff Nielsen, for his new name newsletter, Downwind. Second edition of Downwind should be out tomorrow. AHSA Queensland had its AGM 2 days ago, Wednesday. That was just via Zoom for the AHSAQ members only, followed by a members chat night with 6 presentations about over the horizon radar antennae, finding the whereabouts of Elliott, Queensland, Oster aeroplanes, finding information on the web, in particular operational records of squadrons, a third Lancaster that came to Australia during World War II with 13 navigators. It was on an around the world practical navigation exercise. We're taking all sorts of different navigation procedures. And also we had how to wash a DC-9. The AGM part of that evening hasn't been put on YouTube for all to see. However, Peter Dunn recorded the chat session, which will be up on YouTube shortly. There's been some minor juggling of the committee positions. The new committee comprises President, myself, Warwick Henry, Vice President, Bob Livingston, Secretary, Bob Dunn, OAM, Treasurer, Drummond McKenzie, committee member and newsletter editor, Jeff Nielsen, committee members, Don Furlonger and Ian McDonald. Our guest speaker tonight, Dr. Tom Lewis, OAM. His topic will be Japanese aviators who stayed. And next month, the 25th of March, will be Robin Heathwood flying Padre. We've got plenty of other presentations lined up for the next part of the year. And I'll now hand over to Peter.
Thanks, Warwick. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce to you tonight Dr. Tom Lewis, OAM, who tonight is going to talk to us about Japanese aviators who stayed. Tom is currently in Darwin. These days he lives down near Canberra, but he's up in Darwin for the 80th commemorative events that associated with the bombing of Darwin on the 19th of February 1942. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Dr. Tom Lewis.
Hey, Peter and everyone. I think we were going to talk about those who got left behind, which is a sort of strange title. What does that mean? It's a reference to the Japanese who have stayed here permanently. I'm ex-services, and I suppose you develop a macabre sense of humour, if that's the right word. Some of the Japanese aircrew who were here in the war have never gone home. They're still with us now. It's 186 personnel who died over Northern Australia in the war. First one was on the 15th of February, 1942, 4 days before the carriers arrived. Flying boat was shot down by Lieutenant Robert Buell, who was flying a P-40 Kitty Hawk, and they shot each other down north of the Tiwi Islands. They're those 2 big islands north of Darwin. Neither wreck's been found. Buell died. One of the crewmen died of the flying boat. Ironically, the rest of them made their way ashore to the Tiwis and were found after the carrier raid 4 days later, almost dead. And off they went to Kara to join Hajime Toyoshima, who was a Zero pilot. He came down on Melville Island on the 19th. More famous, nobody's ever heard of the flying boat crew. So that crewman, whose name I've got in my book, The Empire Strikes South, listed all of the crewmen, of the aircrew of the aircraft. He was the first to die. There were 80 Navy chaps who are still here in a submarine outside the harbour. We sank that in January 42. So initially the Japanese had a go with submarines at closing down Darwin. It didn't work. We sank one of them, and it was a pretty close run thing. They tried to close us down with mines and torpedo attacks, and we sank one of them with one of our corvettes. So they retired, licking their wounds. And this is sort of off sort of topic a bit, but it's sort of an illustration of lots of aspects of this Northern War that people don't know. Most people never heard of the submarine. They heard of the carrier attack because it gets on TV these days.
Yep.
So the Japanese retired and had a bit of a think and thought, well, that didn't work. We still want to close Darwin down because we don't want somebody on our right flank harassing us as we take New Guinea. So they sent 4 of the carriers from Pearl Harbor south, and they cleaned us up a treat. They really did a number on us. And then it basically started. They kept coming after that. So moving on, as you can see on the screen there, this is where I've been over the last 20 years, and some of the air aspects are very specific, like the Empire Strikes South, went off to Japan, looked at the Japanese records. And that showed things like the air raids were more numerous than we thought. It's often touted that there's 64 air raids on Darwin. It's actually 77. Some of them got lost and dropped the bombs, but they were still an air raid. To ones which are a bit sort of related, like the Submarine 6 there, talks about Teddy Shi, and as does the one up the top. The Japanese Navy sunk the Armidale north of Darwin. And Zero and Broome, that was the second biggest air raid on Australia, killed 86 people in March 1942. Not very well known though. And some talk about tactics, for example, lethality in combat there. Carrier attack is a massive book. You wouldn't think there'd be so much to talk about on the 19th of February, but there's lots of myths and legends. So thanks, Pete. Next slide. Moving on to people who didn't get left behind in Australia. Here's one, for example, probably the last Zero pilots alive, though a lot of them say that from what I heard. Harada was actually flying over Darwin on the 19th of February. He flew at Pearl Harbor. He's being interviewed there in his home in Nagano, north of Tokyo. About 2015, we went across there with a film crew to film him for the Territory Remembers, which was the 75th anniversary of the first raid. He was a bit sad that he didn't get to fight on the day, quite a famous raid, and he was in the rear echelons. By the time his Zero, one of the 36, arrived, all of the defending Kitty Hawks had either been shot down or fled. So in his early days, starts off in biplane training, and then with a suitably fierce expression there, moved on to the carrier-launched Zero. In fact, all of the air attacks on Australia, except for one, were flown by the Japanese Navy. There's only one that I know of that was flown by the Japanese Army, and of course they had no air force like the Americans in World War II. So most of the raids are from certain types of aircraft. Really the only fighter you get is Zero flying over Australia. There's a couple of flights from Oscars, and the bombers are quite specific too. So there's the famous Val with its non-retractable undercarriage there. The Val only ever made one attack in Australia, the same as the Kate, the three-man single-engine monoplane bomber that came off the carriers on the 19th of February. So the Kate and the Val, they only ever attacked Australia once. The Zero, which was flown on the 19th, they keep coming. They're the fighter that does all of the fighting and escorting. After the Val and the Betty, sorry, the Val and the Kate disappear, the Nell and the Betty move in, and the Betty's really the main bomber that you see over Australia in World War II. Apart from recon aircraft, such as the Babs, then replaced by the Dyna. So we all know about the Zero. Pretty good piece of work, as everybody seems to say. But when you put it up against the Kitty Hawk, the Kitty Hawk's not too bad, as long as you know how to fly it against the Zero. Sort of initially it was, well, you'd be a mug to try and dogfight the Zero. But if you fly the Kitty Hawk in terms of try and get high, try and stay high, and then when you have to attack, you zoom through, you basically dive through the enemy formations, shooting up what you can, and go away as fast as possible. If you do that, then you've got a reasonable chance of flying against the Zero. And the Zero does have its bad points. It's not got any armour, and it's got tanks that catch fire, which is sort of reasonably depressing. The wonderful Betty. We've got bits of one of these in the Aviation Museum here, the Darwin Aviation Museum. It's just had a name change. If you haven't been there, terrific museum. I was there on Thursday night for the launch of my latest book, Australia Remembers 4, The Bombing of Darwin. It's aimed at children. So you've got grandchildren, get out there. Lots of colour and so on. But there's quite a bit of a Betty or 5 in the Aviation Museum. And they do have Toy Shima Zero, which was shot down on Melville Island on the 19th February. He lost oil pressure over Darwin, hit by a 303 round. We know that because we found it in the engine. And he crash landed on Melville Island and was captured by a local Aboriginal bloke. The Betty had a great reputation, I think quite deserved. Known as the flying cigar because of its looks. Nice big red dot there on the Hiramunu on the door, and it does a good job. And they came over and gave us a tasting. What basically happened on the 19th of February was you got 2 raids on the same day. One of 188 aircraft. We shot down 4. And then one of 54 bombers, they were Bettys and Nells, the predecessor, they bombed the airstrips. No fighter escort because they're pretty sure they'd shot everything down, and they had. And then they went away and they came back about a week later, and they just keep coming back. And the bombing spreads from Exmouth in Australia to Townsville in Queensland. And the bombing raids are sometimes 60 aircraft strong. Usually escorted. Of course, we're on the receiving end and we got a pasting. We didn't have nearly what we should have in terms of defence, at least not for a long time. The P-40, as I said before, that was the prevalent fighter over Northern Australia in the first half of 1942 at least. Eventually you start getting the RAF coming up flying these, and eventually in 43, you start getting the Spitfire as well. Never any Hurricanes that I know of. So it's a pretty tough machine, and it was a pretty tough life up here. It's hot, horrible, until you get to the dry season in the middle of the year. Lots of dust. The Kitty Hawk, I don't know, maybe it was the right fighter for the time. It can take a real pounding. They started to hold the line reasonably well, particularly when we start getting radar and radio to link it all together into what we intelligence types call a fuse picture, and searchlights at night, because they did start flying night attacks eventually. Spitfire, famous of course, you had to be fitted with a air scoop, Vokes scissor, underneath because of the heat up here. If you haven't been to Northern Territory, don't come in basically October to April. It's horrible, and you get rain, torrential rain, very sudden fierce storms, and it's terrifically hot, humid, in the mid 30s, but the humidity is up 95%, something like that. The Spitfires had a number of problems, but eventually they the RAF got their head around, started operating them here pretty capably. By that time, we're starting to hold our own. So 1942, very bad year. 1943, much better for us. And the theme of my talk originally was how many of the Japanese stayed here. They started losing the occasional fighter and bomber here and there. Now, of course, as I think a lot of people here would know, most of your losses in World War II are from anything other than combat. So it's mechanical failure, it's pilot failure, navigation, flew into a mountain in cloud, things like that. People left bits and pieces of the aircraft out, all sorts of horrible things. I was doing one of my books, Atomic Salvation, about obviously the atomic attacks, and they're one of the calculations that I got from the United States Army. Air Force records was 6 out of 7. 6 out of 7 aircraft that crashed in their forces in World War II were from anything other than combat. So depressing, isn't it? So eventually what starts running out of here are the USAF bombers and Dutch bombers. The Dutch had a bit of a pounding at Broome originally. Dutch East Indies, back up where Indonesia and Timor and so on is, were a lot of colonies dominated by European countries. And the Dutch had fled out of there, And now they're coming back. And so with RAF assistance, they're running bombers too. But the main bombers are basically USAF. We had, at the end of World War II, 51 airstrips in the Northern Territory, and just about all of them are being operated by USAF. The fighter strips, a lot of RAF stuff there. But you've got two types. You've got the dirt strip and you've got concrete strip. Obviously for the heavier bombers, you're going to need the concrete strip. So back to my theme, here's a chap who stayed here permanently, Shinji Kawahara, and his wife Miyako, who I think she came to the territory anyway. She did eventually, poor lady. Anyway, he died in his aircraft was shot down. When was he shot down? He was shot down by Clive Cornwall, the famous Clive Cornwall in the Spitfire, north of Darwin Harbour. And he was in a Dyna, twin-engine, high-speed reconnaissance aircraft with a camera for the observer. She was in Taiwan at the time, which is called Formosa in those days. And she was evacuated as the Japanese were being pressed back to Japan. She had 2 children from memory. Anyway, she got hit, the freighter got hit by a American submarine. She ended up in the water and supported the kids for a couple of hours. And eventually she was rescued. So she gets all the way back to Japan. And eventually, after the war, she remarried. But she remembers her first husband, there he is. When she died, I don't know what happened to the second husband, but when she died, she said in her will that she wanted her ashes to be scattered next to her husband in Darwin. So eventually, this came to me and a few other people, and we scratched our heads over this one. There he is. I don't think that's even the first photograph on the left, not the second one, I think. And there's a Dyna. So they basically got shot down. We weren't too sure where the aircraft was. I had a number of markings, but you cannot find them around here. My stats in the Empire Strikes South are 62 aircraft shot down and 186 personnel died. Of those 62 aircraft, the majority haven't been found. The territory is absolutely huge. You know how big Australia is. Well, the places that are inhabited up here are not that plentiful. They seem big in Darwin Harbour and so on, but then you go around the corner in a boat or in an aircraft and it's just hundreds of kilometres of mangrove and whatever. So most of these aircraft, we've never found them. Occasionally we did during the war. They got ratted, as they said, for intelligence purposes. If they came down and land, whatever, we'd have a look at what identification we could get, tail numbers, what the crew had on them, trying to work out what squadrons are up against us into the north. But most of them we've never found. Occasionally you do scuba diving, in my first book, Wrecks in Darwin Waters. So occasionally you do find an aircraft wreck and you have a bit of a dive and a bit of a scratch around and try and work out what it is. But we couldn't find the Dyna. So in the end, we basically had a bit of a guess, and north of Darwin Harbour. There she is with the 2 daughters again. And eventually the family come back to, they come to Australia. On the left, my old mate, Peter Stiles, he was the Deputy Chief Minister at the time, back left, that's him. And various members of the family, and most of them couldn't speak a lot of English. We had translators and so on. Why have you come to Australia? To scatter the ashes. Eventually, here's us. There's me on the front right, wearing medals and so on. And there's one of the family relatives, and she's about to scatter the ashes. So this is the other side of Darwin Harbour. Looks pretty pretty, but it was very hot. And there's a chaplain there in navy whites. This was a combination effort. The Navy came to the party, the NT government, the Darwin City Council, the Japanese, Australian Japanese Association, all put time into this to get these people out there and so to do the right thing. I've done 3 of these at sea, 3 scattering of ashes, and our Navy person. So I understand a bit about how boats work. In every occasion, they want to scatter the ashes quickly. They're a bit upset and they want to do it. And you've got to stop them. You've got to say, stop and wait until the boat swings off the anchor. Otherwise, the ashes are going to go all over you. So you've got to think about the wind. So we did that. And it's a bit of an unusual example of a Japanese who remained here being joined by one of the relatives who died in Japan. Sad if you think about it, but it's got some poignancy, some beauty in it as well. There we go. Good on everybody, I think. We talk a bit about Japanese-Australian relations up here. We just had the ambassador here the other day unveiling a plaque to the submariners with their names on it, and he was at the ceremony on Saturday. It's a bit of a touchy sort of thing, but 80 years now, we're friends, I think. Here's another strange one. This bloke was shot down in another diner, and he's called Shady Camp, where the red dot is, and it's quite a popular fishing spot, which is the #1 sport up here. There's Darwin top left and the Tiwi Islands in the top left as well. So he was actually in a diner and he was shot down, and he was a bit of a hero. This bloke, Sasaki. He was an ace, and in Japan he was in the newspapers when he was lost. Lo and behold, I think it was his mum. She decided that she would have a doll, of all things, dropped over the site where he was shot down by another diner. The trouble is, we shot that diner down as well, and the doll ended up in the wreckage. We don't know what is this? We don't know what's going on. And they were buried. And post-war, this story came about. Oh, interesting. One of the interesting things is too, there's part of the diner, the first diner, in the bottom left there. That plaque there was placed post-war, and now it's lost. And so the Australian Japanese Association had a bit of a project. I'm a member of that. And we were going to use ground penetrating radar and find the two chaps from the wreck and put a new plaque over the top. It would have cost about 10,000 or something to employ the radar. And in the end, we didn't get the grant, so it hasn't been done. It gives you an example of the Japanese who sometimes the grave is marked and then just disappears. Really fierce weather and lots of animals and things like that. And so a little plaque sometimes just disappears and now you can't find the bodies. But they are scattered here. In the main, they were, if they crashed on land, we reached them, they were hastily buried. You haven't got a lot of time, I suppose, for your enemy in World War II, but they're human beings and we try to do the right thing. Yeah, there's a bit more detail on the Japanese doll case and so on. Mum was also rich and she put in some money for a new aircraft. Many and strange are the adventures up here. It was a big war, lots of aircraft, lots of squadrons. Last one was shot down in, when was it? 12th of June in the Northern Territory, 1944. Last air raid, November 43. We shot down another diner on the next year, 1944. And I think the last recorded flight was August 44 over Western Australia. There was, strangely enough, a landing near Truscott Air Force Base at one stage by some army people who were apparently looking for it. There's lots of legends about strange landings up here, and when I look into them, it's always the mate of a mate of a mate said that. True. Lots of conspiracy stories as well. So only one landing that I know of. Pretty tough. Mercy given on most sides. A little bit of that sort of stuff. Parachuting, aircrew being machine gunned. I covered that in lethality in combat in a chapter. Tactical air combat and the brutality of it. It was a tough war. They were basically coming over, we'd jump on them as from height if we could, get surprise on them and chase them all the way out to sea and back halfway to Indonesia. If they did come down to water, they often got strafed, and so did we. So you got a fair bit of that. a few stories about captured airmen being mistreated. Some of the Aboriginal people on some of the outlying areas just shot them. Yeah, I imagine that happened too. The things that I was referring to before, the A-bomb attacks, that eventually brings the whole thing to a halt. The raids against Japan, as we know, a bit off topic here, mainly carried out by the B-29s. That book there talks about how, look, if they hadn't been used, this would have been going on and on and on, maybe until the end of 1947, with a tactical, with a standard invasion D-Day of Japan. The stats in that book are pretty shocking. We would have lost well over 1 million in Allied forces by the look of it, and they would have lost probably up to around about 30 million when the whole population is told, guess what you're doing? You're in the militia with muskets and suicide divers and suicide speedboats, and of course not only that, the kamikazes, which they had 10,000. So a pretty tough war. By this time, the war starts moving away from Australia. One of the more famous people up here, RAF veteran Austin Ash, was at the ceremony last week. He's 96 now. He was radar. I think it was on Goodenough Island, North and Western Australia. He said most of the time they never saw Japanese. They just moved away by the time he got there. So the war moves away from Australia, and even the bombing raids that we have coming out of here are not much use anymore because the Japanese target's too far away. So the squadrons leave and everybody moves north. With this war, it's not just an air war, it's a sea war. And it's very much a war that's prosecuted at sea. And have a look at the air defences on that ship there. The beginning of the war, you quite happily attacked warships in an aircraft. And the dive bomber was invented, and of course the Stuka before that. But the dive bomber does a reasonable job against surface vessels. At the end of the war, nobody in their right mind uses dive bombers against warships. They're just too dangerous. They'll kill you. And they'll kill you too if you don't have the right recognition signals or approach from the wrong position or something like that. Very, very dangerous war. But an interesting combination of an air war and a sea war, I think, and not so much a land war as Europe was. And of course, the kamikazes being used. The dedicated kamikaze, which is specifically designed for it, and the guy who decides, well, I'm not going to be able to go home because the wheels are falling off or something, and I'm going to just strike the nearest target, as this bloke is trying to do here. And of course, your reaction time is in milliseconds. Very, very difficult. And there's a couple of grim stats for you. That's sort of the sort of thing you get here. And an interesting jump back to Darwin there. One of the first recorded bombing missions over Darwin, it's in one of the Japanese records, that so-and-so decided very bravely to dive into a ground target. He wasn't going home, so he chose a big building, dived into that. I couldn't work out exactly which building it was, but I don't think he hit it. But it gives you an idea. No parachutes being worn either by the fighter crews over here. So if your wings started falling off, you just look for something to suicide into. That was what you did. Yeah, tough times, eh? And it's not just, of course, the deaths. So 186 personnel the Japanese lost in aircrew. Of that, you're getting roughly about 4 times as many. So you're probably talking about 1,000 Japanese whose lives were irredeemably messed up by the air attacks against Australia. And of course, our people too. At the Darwin Military Museum, they have a memorial wall there with several thousand names on it. So there's our people who have been recorded there. I wasn't that interested in doing the Japanese count until our people have been counted. And it's difficult sort of stuff, because sometimes you get a person like this poor chap here, he dies 2 days later. So would you count him now, or do you count him then, or what? Difficult. So that's the rough statistic. For everyone who dies, it's about 4 who get seriously wounded. And who'd be in the crew, eh? They don't look a terribly happy bunch. The war is then turning into a carrier war. I think it was 36 carriers. The Brits and the Americans had almost all American in the Pacific in mid-45. And this is the conventional assault that's massing to strike the Japanese with the D-Day type idea. Yeah, and they don't look very happy there either. He's been there before and he's going back, he knows it too. So to finish up, there's some of the statistics as to what we have, and there's the spread of operations in the north. Most of them concentrated on the Northern Territory, but Western Australia gets its fair share. Long-range flying boats, mainly out of Rabaul, hitting Queensland. They're not always. And the north are very much fortified against these sort of things. That's Townsville, I think, in the middle there, down the bottom. And I like to use that middle number 1883 because it sort of impresses people. It's sort of, what? I didn't realise that. And you get this, oh, really? It was North Australia War. I thought it was just the 19th of February. You get a bit tired of that. It's sort of the spread of the conflict and the enormous impact it had. It is a funny oddity of our history, of course, that most of our history is so concentrated down south. It's only in the last 25 years or so that the knowledge of this sort of stuff has become more and more prevalent. And just to finish up on the Japanese note there, it's a cemetery at Berrima, which is about 10 k's from Darwin as you go down the Stewart Highway on the left there. And eventually graduated to Japanese grave markers. And then in the 1950s and early 60s, they were disinterred and taken down to that rather beautiful cemetery down at Cowra, which ironically is where Toyoshima, the Zero pilot, had led the breakout. He was one of the leaders of the breakout. I think he blew the bugle at midnight for the breakout, where over 1,000 Japanese escaped, and most of them got recaptured, and quite a few died, including Toyoshima. So the Japanese have largely, the formal graves have disappeared from here. They're not near Adelaide River War Cemetery, south of Darwin, along with our people. There's over 400 there. As I've said, there's a lot of aircraft that have crashed that we've never found. Occasionally they do turn up, and interesting they are too, to try and put it all together with what we've got in the record books. And so some of the things that we can do here, just to finish off, is a lot of the time, hopefully, we can start to correct the records. You do get a bit sort of annoyed with some of the legends too, that hundreds more died and the government covered it up, and that sort of stuff, which keep coming back. Sometimes people prefer a decent conspiracy story to the truth. That's sort of one of the more satisfying aspects of being able to research in the area and to be able to say something about it. And I think that's about it. We've got one more slide to go. That's it. Yeah.
Last slide.
A long time.
Thank you very much. I'll just stop that share. Thanks, Tom. That was very good. That was excellent, in fact. Can I ask a couple of questions? One, you made a comment about 77 air raids. Can I just clarify, is that 77 on Darwin and the Darwin area, or 77 on the whole of the Northern Territory?
It's on Darwin, it's 138. Sorry, on the Northern Territory, it's 138 raids, air missions, call them what you will. 77 of those seem to be raids against Darwin.
Right, okay.
The last one's November 43, which actually wasn't against Darwin, against Adelaide River.
Yeah, and I think the popular history says 64, doesn't it? From
Yeah,
memory? Yeah, okay. The other controversy about numbers is the number of people killed in Darwin on that 19th of February 1942. I think you've done some research on the numbers.
Yeah, 236, and
236.
yeah, and it's not so much for me. Paul Rosenzweig in South Australia, John Richards, who was up here with the Northern Territory lot. There's quite a few people put their cents worth in over the years with papers and so on, analysing it. And we're pretty happy that it's 236. There's a thing called the NT Roll of Honour maintained by the NT Library here, which is in Parliament House. That lists them all. We actually added an Aboriginal chap the other day called Cahoon. We couldn't find a second name.
Yep.
He seems to have been a local who came back into town.
Right.
Most of them have been evacuated down to Adelaide River. And he was, for some reason, he got caught by some shrapnel in that first raid. And we're pretty happy now, well, a wrong way of putting it, we're pretty happy now that that statistic is fairly firm.
What does the War Memorial say? How many?
They're sort of well behind. They'll often, but they used to quote Lockwood's figure, which was 245.
For some reason I had 243 in the back of my mind, but
243's been, that's popular too. But we did a fair bit of analysis into Peary, and Peary at one stage was up to about 93. The famous one about USS Peary is Dallas Widdick and Mel Duke, who were from the Peary, who came back to town, I think it was in 92, and they found their own names on a list of all those people. So they said, we'll do some work on it. And they went away and did some research, and even their research was wrong because they were in a couple of blokes. And what actually happens is, especially on ships, you get things like they've got a manifest bill of lading, various ways of putting it, different countries. And two chaps will have got off in the last port, and they're still on the list on the ships. And they, okay, there's the list. But they got off just before it arrived, and somebody else got on, and that sort of thing.
Very difficult. I know I had a bit of a go at getting the numbers, and I can't remember what number I arrived at, but yeah, it's extremely difficult. The other one that I had a go at, which I don't think anyone seems to have done, was the numbers killed in the Battle of the Coral Sea. So I spent quite a lot of time coming up with some things.
Very difficult. And we noticed that we had, was it Keith Davern? He was on Menunda, the hospital ship.
Oh, yeah.
He died, I think it was 3 days later.
Okay.
He's a casualty. The trouble was that he was sick with something or other, and he was going to die anyway.
Yeah.
He didn't actually die as a result of the Darwin raid. So
I don't know if you can see that.
Egg cup.
It's egg cap, and it says MV Menunda.
Okay.
And there's another one. Says the same thing. MV Menunda. I think the ship was used after the war as a passenger ship plying up the coast of Queensland. And my dad, I think, caught the ship from Townsville to Brisbane once for a business trip back in the 50s, I guess. And I think he must have bought them or snavelled them off the table or bought them as souvenirs. So,
where there's a big row about Margaret de Mestre off the Menunda. It looks like she died and fell overboard or something. Anyway, there was a burial of about, 14 bodies that were recovered in the mud near Darwin, and they were burying bodies all over the place temporarily and marking morgues. And anyway, when they came back to disinter them later on, they couldn't find the grave. And she was probably one of them. He was the first nurse to die on Australian soil. So the Mestre family have raised a row about it over the years. Want the army to go and do more about it. Royal Army saying,
Okay, well, we'll wrap up. Thanks again, Tom, for doing this presentation for the Aviation Historical Society of Queensland. Thank you very much. On the research, I just put a note back in the chat. Gordon put a comment that the popular figure, I think from the AWM, was 243, and I did some research too, and I checked mine after this recorded his talk, and I also arrived at 236. So obviously might be some that I'm missing, perhaps, that the AWM have found somewhere.
Just a brief comment, Peter. Some years ago now, I visited the site of Truscott in the Kimberleys,
Yeah.
and sometime after that, in Perth, at some museum enclosure in Perth, there was wreckage allegedly from a diner. Allegedly, again, the last aircraft shot down over Australian territory on the ground. And one of the curious things about it was that inside the fuselage, there were pencilings, various ones. Obviously, I wouldn't understand what they were, but quite prominently were the 3 diamonds of Mitsubishi. And it looked as though they were not something added by some unauthorized person. It looked as though it was something inscribed there by the manufacturing organisation or somebody working in it.
Okay. Yep. Was it this diner here, 200 yards offshore near Truscott?
Or whatever it was, there was wreckage anyway.
Yeah.
So I gathered that it was on ground.
Yeah, okay. Righto. Yeah, there was obviously a few of them.
I got a question. Jeff, that aircraft behind you, I think, that they have on Flamingo, is it right? Jeff Nielsen, the aircraft behind you?
You're muted, Jeff.
Yes, it's
And what engines have they got?
that had a really strange de Havilland designed engine. It had an inline engine, a V12, but it wasn't a V12. It was 2 rows of 6 parallel rows.
Oh, yeah.
There was a big air intake just out on the outboard side of each engine in the wing leading edge, and part of the power of the engine sucked in air there and blew it forward around the cylinders. That was the cooling system.
Yeah.
So it was an inline engine, but air cooled.
Ah.
And it had some other really strange features as well. It was far more radical than the aircraft. The only thing strange about the aircraft was that it was an airliner. It was made of wood.
Yeah.
Right.
So you're graceful looking airplane.
Yes. They only built about 6 of them in 1939. So obviously they lost interest in that in September 1939. They had more important things to do. But that was part of a whole string of aircraft that they used to develop their plywood construction.
Yeah.
It's not plywood that you'd buy at a hardware store. Each strip of ply was laid at precise angles, and they alternated. Each layer of it was alternated with different types of wood. They developed that to quite a high standard, and they actually were able to produce them fairly quickly. But the only one that got a really big production was of the Mosquito.
Yeah.
And even the Mosquito had steel tubular frame for engine mounting and around the centre fuselage, Bombay and all that. So that was quite interesting. If you look that up, it's de Havilland Albatross.
For our southern friends who are still logged on, this is the weather we've got in Brisbane at the moment. We've had this for a couple of days now.
Yeah.
It's
Really teeming now.
not going away. I'll zoom out a bit. It's been like that for a few days. Just keeps coming up from the top here.
Brisbane's right in the middle of that lot.
Peter, can you just shift that to Cannigan for Sunny Coast? Up one.
Go up one, just there. I'll zoom out. to 512. There's 512.
Hmm.
There's 256. Rainbow Beach, I can see.
Yep.
Taunton, there you go. There's Taunton just there.
Yeah.
Just there. So it just keeps developing and feeding in and coming down to us.
Warwick, that was a de Havilland 91.
91. Yeah.
You look that up and get a description of the engines. There are websites showing how they were constructed and how they operated. I don't have them right at my fingertips at the moment.
Father-in-law flew the last war away out of Indonesia on March 7th, 42.
Just couldn't quite catch all of that, Mary. You said your father-in-law was flying a away.
Yeah, just before Indonesia capitulated to the Japanese, he left Java on March 7th, 1942, flying the very last plane to leave Indonesia, arriving in Australia.
Oh.
This plane was a DC-3, nicknamed the war Willowa. The plane was hidden under the bushes and the Japanese were 15 kilometers from them. So they had to escape literally back. They took to Bangoon in West Java to arrive at Fort Headlands in Western Australia. So it's just some of the story that he wrote. That was interesting that it's almost March 7th, and March 7th is my birthday. Just coincidentally, these dates always come up with us, I think. He was a flight engineer for KLM in Indonesia before the war. And then when the war started, he offered the services for Royal Dutch Indonesian Navy. So, and he used to fly the Cessnas, the Catalinas, I should say, Catalinas, for the 321 squadron for the Royal Dutch Indonesian Navy.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll just share a screen here. Just running a YouTube video.
There it is.
That's it.
Yeah.
See the air intakes around the engines?
Yep.
How many passengers?
A few dozen, I suppose. Yeah.
Card table.
Yeah.
British Airways.
One of these was allocated to Winston Churchill as his Air Force One.
Oh,
But
yeah.
it didn't see much service, and it was replaced by an LB-30,
B-24.
passenger version of a B-24.
Yep.
Um,
Sort of looks as though it ought to have a bit more rudder and fin down the back.
Twin fins. Big intakes here. Are they air intakes, those big holes?
They're cooling air intakes.
Yeah, there's quite a few of them.
It's a sort of a forced draft
Big wheels.
Yeah.
air cooling. Extremely streamlined and smooth shape.
Rain's pouring down again.
There you go. There's a remote controlled version. There, another one here. No, it looks a different one. It's a few of them.
Can I ask a question there, Peter, or Jeff Nielsen? If you've studied this aircraft a bit, tell me, what was the main spar built from?
I think it was a kind of laminated box.
Well, in other words, it was wooden, or was it?
Yes, it was wooden.
Definitely wooden, huh? Okay.
Like a mosquito. Wouldn't
Yeah. Okay.
Well, that was another fascinating night. I really enjoyed that.